China needs stability. United States, on the other hand, could really, like a old drunken fellow in the bar who's still asking for a free drink, turn the tables up and create a mess in the pub and in the bar at the global level. The rest of the patrons would like to have a drink, talk about how they can go about their way. Can you steer up China, as Professor Mearsheimer is saying? They can. And can China lash back? They can. But is China here to systematically uproot Europe and United States? I totally disagree. I don't think, at least in our lifetimes and in another, you see this trap and all of these things, make nice taglines and headlines for think tanks and the papers that are shuffled out. China needs continuity and commerce.
Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Ali Borhani, a geopolitical strategist and the co-host of the BRI-Diaolgue podcast, on which he talks to experts, decision makers and academics about all things geopolitics and especially about China's Belt and Road Initiative. In fact, Ali has been watching China very closely and included his findings in a report that he entitled The Rise of Chinese Multinationals. His insights are business focused and business relevant, so this business side of things is what we want to discuss today. Ali, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you, Pascal.
Well, thank you very much for coming online. You invited me to your podcast before, and you asked me questions that let me explain my points very happily. I will link to the discussion as well in the description here. But today I would like to have the chance to focus on you and your view on geopolitics, and then especially also China. Could you maybe, first of all, give us your overall macro assessment of where we are in 2025?
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. I think interesting times we live in. So maybe it's, apt to start with a quote, not from Ali, but let me read it for you and your audience. The Chinese have been able to preserve their empire for 4,000 years. Long ago, they already had inventions that the Europeans proudly believed that they discovered, namely printing, gunpowder, the compass, steel weaving, the decimal system, and so many other things. The Chinese have ancient classics full of deepest wisdom, philosophical insights, far superior to our classical antiquity. And unlike the Europeans, they had the good sense to apply these ancient ideas to the actual practice of government, which shows how intelligent they are. They're not Christians, but have hospitals for orphans and old and sick. They have welfare offices where food is provided for the destitute and medicine for the sick. Along the roads, and I'll come back to that because we live in the time of Belt and Road Initiative, they provide shelters for the free use of travelers. How dare one that can say that a nation that displays such enlightenment, generosity, and wisdom is inferior in any way to us Europeans? That is Père Gabet, a French missionary in China in 1845, Pascal. So the reason I'm reading that quote is interesting because we live in the time of labeling. And at the macro level, the latest assessment between the two superpowers was J.D. Vance's comments about the peasants and buying from the peasants. And, so we're at the crux of moving from a unipolar world order to, I would say, a multipolar, but with a significant presence of bipolar architects, actors, and contenders. And at a macro level, I think the challenge today, whether, you're in global south or among the global majority, whether you're in Ottawa, as of today with Mark Carney, or in Copenhagen, or in Mexico City, or, for that matter, anywhere around the world or in Beijing, the key question is what is the United States going to do and how it's going to posture. And that is sending various messages to capitals, to markets, to all of the, decision makers. And I think we have to look at that in the context of this rivalry and the rising heat in weaponization. And by weaponization, I'm talking about weaponization of dollars and the sanctions, weaponization of, tariffs at the moment and trade flows. And the key question is, what next? Will that be a weaponization of capital markets and foreign direct investment and flow of capital? Interestingly enough, at the macro level, because you asked me, it seems that the world is changing its posture as well. And I'm not talking about the Western Hemisphere, I'm talking about the global South and majority. In the latest Ipsos poll, 48% of the people who were polled around the world for the very first time said that they think that China has a positive impact in the world, and United States at 46%. This is the first time that in a global poll, the majority think that China's posturing is more positive than the incumbent, which is the United States over the past 50 years. And sticking with that element of macro optics, Pascal, I think part of it as well is what people see and hear and the tangibility of what can they touch and feel. United States came out with Build Back a Better World, Europe with a global gateway. And regardless of the fact that some of the BRI's 1.0 initiatives were having their own handicaps, their own challenges, there is still a railway between Mombasa and, Nairobi, and people can feel and touch it. 1.5 trillion has gone into hard infrastructure around the world, and people are beneficiaries of these investments in the global South and among the global majority. And only 50 billion has been deployed for Build Back a Better World, while around 300 billion has been shifted to Ukraine. So in the eyes of the macro optics of the world, people see things in a different light. And I think this is a trend, Pascal, in my opinion.
Yeah,
Please.
it's of course very interesting because BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is China's kind of catchphrase for its foreign investments, right? And its strategic foreign investments. And this has in the US and in Europe has often been pictured as, aggressive and predatory and trying to exploit the poor country's dependencies on Chinese money. It's quite fantastic to me how this has been spun into something very negative. Could you maybe recall me, tell me again, like when did China start with BRI, and how did it strategically develop, and why is it that they frame it as Belt and Road Initiative, this connectivity factor in their investments?
Sure. The official announcement of Belt and Road Initiative was in 2013, and that was a key centerpiece announcement and initiative by President Xi. But China has been preparing for the BRI way before that. And a great part of that has been the foresight and realizing, the long-term planning that they have the demographic issues. They have to push their capacities, extra capacity, extra capabilities, their standards outside to the global markets. And China remains a dependent nation for a lot of its, needs, whether it's agri-food commodities, food security, whether it's for energy. And at the same time, China realized that, wow, we're upgrading our capacities and capabilities and standards. We have to go out. And this coming out was a conscious decision by China. And today, Pascal, if you look at Belt and Road Initiative, which you rightly said has been, painted in a very predatory way. Mind you, on BRI-Dialogues, we've had guests from UN, US Stern School of Business in the United States, and experts who categorically have come out and said the debt and, colossal debt of the global South to IMF and World Bank is far bigger than what they owe to China. And restructuring of that debt is much easier with the Chinese in many ways rather than the, I would say, legacy institutions. But the reality is that China, at the end of the day, has mastered certain sectors, industries, and these capacities and capabilities have arrived to their streams and bandwidths at home. I'll come in a bit of a later in our conversation. I hope we'll have a chance to talk about renewables and where China is going with renewables. But today, China is, setting up a Chancay port in Peru, increasing its infrastructure investments in Latin America, setting up a BYD factory probably in Turkey. So part of all of this is a demand from the global south as well, with a technology and an innovation and a price point that China is able to meet. So the quality, I would say, improvement, the price affordability, and the need of the global south have converged through this BRI. So it takes two to tango. It's not something that China is going and force feeding, roads and autobahns and water dams and hospitals to these nations. These countries have needs for these infrastructure. I was joking in a conference in Ottawa, in Montreal last June, and my fellow panelists said, "Oh, but United States still has a cultural dominance." And I said, "Yes, you can still bring Taylor Swift or I don't know, Beyonce, but they need a stadium to attend that concert, and Chinese will bring the stadium, you bring Beyonce." So I think the infrastructure gap has presented itself as a great opportunity for China to push through BRI and meet the need. So that is in a nutshell, and I hope I was able to answer your question. And by the way, just to contrast, the global gateway has been around 280, 300 billion deployed by the entire EU for countering Belt and Road Initiative. BRI has been roughly $1.5 trillion so far and counting. And US Build Back a Better World so far, according to our research, around $50 to $70 billion. That's a massive gap.
Yeah, so I mean, in short, China's strategy at the moment seems to be massive investment into global infrastructure, right? Into providing, like, developing, or let's call them global South countries with what they need in order to also link up with China in this modern day trade route. So in a sense, like, it's Belt and Road, not just physical roads, but also all the rest that you need in order for roads then to function and for sea lanes of communications to function. Now, you wrote this special report about China, and you are also framing it around multinationals. I think what intrigues me there is this role of how the Chinese private economy obviously is then supposed to benefit of this global infrastructure that the Chinese state now builds. Could you maybe talk about that a bit, and what to expect, how open this infrastructure will be for others who might also then want to use it?
Sure. This is a report that was in making, and I have to say it was co-authored by myself and my fellow partner in this initiative, Nenad Pacek, who is a renowned economist, and he used to be the vice president of Economist Intelligence Unit for a long, long time, and now runs his own practice. And we took a good almost a year and a half of studying, digging deep into the rise of Chinese multinationals. And, it's important. I always say, in order to know where you're going, to know where you're coming from. And the rise of China in the past 50 years is nothing short but remarkable, the massive in any context, rising 400 million and counting people out of poverty. So we needed to understand how China arrived here. Where is this financing coming from? And is China on the verge of, implosion because of real estate debt, and all of the sound bites? And to get to understand where this momentum initiated from. And in uh, Middle East, there is an expression. It says, when you have fever, don't go to the doctor. Go to your friend who had fever, and he will tell you what you expect and what you should go through. So you'll be interested to know that we interviewed 30 CEOs and directors, heads of multinationals, of Western multinationals, and put them to the test of what are they facing, how are they competing with China. And I have to tell you, it was very hard to hear any of them saying that today the Chinese cannot compete with them on quality or on price, which is fascinating. And these are top tier multinationals,
They
blue chip.
said that they believe the Chinese cannot compete with them, so they are
No,
much
no,
superior.
there is no way that they cannot compete with them. So they
Ah,
can beat them on price and even climb up on the quality ladder. So,
the
so the
Chinese
competition.
can. The
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's fascinating when you listen to that because it basically sends a message that in any given category, and these 30 interviews, for your information, Pascal, are all in different sectors, from healthcare, industrial equipment, automotive, fashion, security, rare metals, minerals, mining. It's mind-boggling that hardly in any of these sectors, any of these key heads of this incumbent, blue chips could say, no, they're not a challenge to us. Oh, no, we can hands down. And those who said that, no, they haven't closed the gap yet, said they haven't decided to close that gap. It doesn't mean it's a conscious decision. We know that they are, we can feel their breath on our neck. And part of this, in my opinion, is as well interesting to look at because it's very interesting, again, back to the conversations and the macro touch of, what J.D. Vance said. And three of the presidents of China have all been engineers. Jiang Zemin was an electrical engineer. Hu Jintao is hydropower engineer. Xi Jinping is a chemical engineer. And when you look at, it's very telling in my opinion. Whereas that pivot and pointing at peasantry, Jimmy Carter was a peasant and a farmer himself, of a peanut farmer. Then you have Bill Clinton, a lawyer, Barack Obama, a lawyer, Joe Biden, a lawyer, and yes, Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump as well. So the outlook towards engineering an economic model and a competition model is very interesting to see what is the mindset. Now, this is a subject of an anthropologist to understand if three engineers are running consecutively the second largest economy in the world, has that had any impact on the thinking and long-term planning or not? But the report has been very telling in my opinion, for our audience and people who have purchased it and dug into it as a compass as to where China is going. And I think part of that as well brings us to the vectors and the way that China is adding the global south to the dual circulation domestically. China sees the erosion of its market share, or market access, I should say, not market share, erosion of its market access through this punitive sanctions, tariffs, and, this dance of the past, particularly 8 to 12 years of, Biden, Trump, and which pivoted to Asia through the Obama times. So China is decoupling in many ways, and maybe it's embracing itself as well of having the world as its oyster and adding that to domestic consumption. But China is here to stay. Our findings are that, the risking and decoupling for China is something that they are embracing it, Pascal. The real estate, headlines were nothing to rock the boat as such, because all of these debts as well are denominated in renminbi and in yuan, so they don't have an external exposure. And and I think China is going under a strategic economic transformation. And it matters, in my opinion, to understand, and maybe we should talk a little bit, if you like, as well, about the relevance of China today in the world in that context.
I would definitely like to do that. But before this, where's this? There's these couple of I don't want to call them myths, but talking points, and one of them has been over the past couple of years that the Chinese um, um, the housing market is about to implode. You know, the massive uh, overburdening and too much taking on of debt, and this is going to be a 2008 on Chinese level and Chinese scale, and everything's going to come down. Now we've been waiting for that now for years. Why are these topics so huge in the West? And even when they don't come true, they still linger on, and people just wait to say like, "Look, we told you." Now they're like one of their construction companies is having a problem.
Well, I think there are two elements of looking at this. Part of that extra capacity that went into real estate was at the moment was that the massive lending by the local banks, state banks, and building and creating part of that prosperity movement. And then they overstretched it and they over leveraged it. And then there was this decree by President Xi that real estate is for housing and living, not speculation. And then the hammer came down, and then they didn't say that, oh, you're too big to Venki or to Evergrande, too big to fail, unlike the models that we see sometimes in the Western Hemisphere. And I think now the focus has gone, surprisingly, ever more so, that the banks are encouraged to shift and focus on even further lending on industrial lending and, to focus on export-driven AI, quantum technology, EVs. The number of car companies that are competing in China today dwarfs all of the European and American manufacturers combined. And China is going through a trade diversion strategy and diversifying globally and domestically. And I think it is important to realize that China today, exports 3 times more to the United States than United States to China. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the intensity and significance and importance of what China sends to the United States, it's not just the Walmarts and the Targets and the supermarkets of America. It's in very relevant, significant technological elements that without that, United States would be really crippled, and we will talk about that. And I think this infatuation that China is going to fall is overstretched, as you rightly said. And today, China trades more and more on an hourly basis with the rest of the world than United States and Western Hemisphere. So the reality is that as we are speaking, 15,000 Chinese companies are operating in UAE, 15,000 Chinese companies. China is developing with Saudi Arabia the possibility of developing clean tech. Saudi Aramco's head was in China just 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, talking about the expansion of the relationship. Trip to Malaysia by President Xi Jinping, CATL expansion to Hungary. You look at renewables in Iraq. So there is no way that we say, oh, because there was a real estate burst in China, the rest of the bridges in a metamorphical way that China is building around the world will be underfunded and crumble. And maybe that's a good segue as well, if you allow me just to talk a bit about how China controls what the future holds, both from the renewables and from rare earth minerals. And I like to share some statistics with you and your audience here, which I have prepared for you. One is the mining of rare earths and minerals is a long-term process. This idea that we're going to occupy Greenland and take over Canada, and then we have rare earths is just childish in more ways than one. We have around 1,360 something, 362 days left from Trump presidency. Even if he occupies Greenland tomorrow and takes over Canada, and even if he mobilizes all of the federal and assets to set up that value chain, this is a byproduct of minimum 8 to 12 years of mastering the upstream, which is mining, which is the crushing, the grinding of mineral, of rare earth elements, to midstream, which I come to, which is separation of rare earth elements and the refinery alloying and all of that. And then the downstream applications, which are in EVs, in military hardware, in iPhones, and renewables, semiconductors, lasers, converters. And it reminds me of this joke that this guy goes, the way that United States is trying to cordon off China in this global macros value chain. It's a bit naughty, but I have to share it and brings a laughter. So this guy goes to the dentist and lays down on the unit. And as the dentist comes with the mask and the drill and is about to go to his mouth, he grabs the testicles of the dentist and says, "Doctor, we're not going to hurt each other, are we?" So, so, so the reality is that, it's not like United States has a monopoly of drilling with sanctions and etc. This value chain is interconnected. And if China tomorrow applies the same metrics of saying, we're not going to send you any rare earths or any rare earth extractions while we, mine close to 65% of it, and 80% of that is in many ways in our hands in terms of processing, etc. It's going to be a very big challenge for United States, So China's relevance is something that we shouldn't overlook.
So,
And
sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, but does this mean that you're interpreting that China's relatively constrained responses to the United States tariffs, like tariff frenzy that Donald Trump unleashed, also is still relatively modest and taken aback because China could put on the hurt much more, not just like matched U.S. tariffs, but actually then these rare earths. And I think they did actually say we are going to have export restrictions, but they did so in very measured and targeted ways and not across the board. How are you interpreting these moves, and what would be the most hurtful restrictions that China, with just what it controls, could use in order, if it really wanted to hurt the United States, if that was the goal? But I don't think that's the goal at the moment. They don't want to hurt the US.
no, I think China, as you rightly said, has been for the past 12, 16 years of this past few terms in a Tai Chi mode. I always joke and I say, the United States is like Chuck Norris, and coming and kicking and all of that. And China is in a Tai Chi mode and thinking. So there is a measured response. But the reality is there is no way that today United States could take a blow of a full ban of rare earth minerals and elements from China if China was to tighten that screw. And on that front as well, China can up the ante by selling treasuries, by calling out its, financial metrics vis-a-vis United States. And all of these things as well lead into the future of renewables. So yes, Donald Trump comes and says, drill, baby, drill. But the reality is that 86% of the world, in some polls, agree that climate change is a real issue. And these rare earth minerals are essential across the board. It's not just the EVs. Across the board for the future sustainability and the industries for which the Europeans and Americans are, preaching the whole world and championing. So China has been, to a very great extent, in my opinion, measured in its response. But where I think we're overstretching it is we're underestimating that even the most flexible, elastic has a stretch point. And the key question is how far United States can stretch Beijing, how far United States can continue to stretch in various directions, as I said, from Copenhagen to Ottawa to Beijing to Brussels, to Middle East, given the climate and the tensions that are brewing there as well. And at some point, I think that overstretching of hubris will be very, very challenging for the well-being of the United States. And China doesn't want that. China, I don't think, neither is ready nor willing to act as what the United States wants or aspires still to preserve. China would like to continue. I don't think Xi Jinping wakes up in the morning to think about how to start a war with the United States, whereas he's thinking about how to feed and provide, I would say, prosperity for 1.4 billion people. But something I want to just touch on while you were talking about that. If you remember, Pascal, we started with the telecom war. The first one was with Huawei. Then we went to tech war. Now we're in trade war, tariff war. Then we went to transit war, Panama Canal. I mean, Hutchison, one power. Why is this, in the hands of Chinese as, on the one side of Panama Canal? Then we went to textile war with Shane, the postage and the value of so this is a perpetuation of all of them. Funny enough, they start with T, telecom, tech, tariff, trade, textile. The key question is how far US wants to go down this road. China, I'm sure, doesn't want to. And when you look at CCP, one could say that CCP so far has been a benign actor globally. China has arrived economically as the second world power today, where it is without coup d'etats, without regime changes, without wars, without occupations, without invasions. And one of the ironies that I find in the dialogue and conversation around the rise of China is the global emissions. And, that China is always accused as the largest emitter globally. And I say there is a delta there that we haven't attended to, and that is the emissions from construction and production, which is China's weight. But if you take United States emissions from construction and production as the second largest, and add to that the emissions of United States through destruction and wars from, Vietnam to Afghanistan to Iraq to, Libya and from Latin America, and you add that delta as well, then all of a sudden the total emissions of United States shoot to the roof, you know? So China has been in many ways, in the eyes of the majority and global South, far more benign for its power and where it is today. We're not going to go into the repetition of 850 military bases of United States around the world and China with one in Djibouti. But these are realities that people see and feel, So that's something that I think is worthwhile focusing on.
Yeah, but this goes into a question that I have on my mind, which is about this argument by John Mearsheimer. And I respect
Mhm.
Mearsheimer for many, many reasons. But he has this argument saying that, look, China is the only peer competitor of the United States. China needs to be contained because of its structural role, because at the end of the day, great powers do what great powers do, maximize security, and economic power will become military power, and the Chinese will use military power just the way that the US uses military power in order to shape the international system according to its will and to increase its security. Now, your observation is very, very relevant because the United States, when it became a great power, it started behaving exactly how the British Empire behaved before it, right? Try to dominate the sea, dominate trade, create military power, and then and project military power everywhere. And that's then how they became big, right? Especially after the Second World War and all dominant. China hasn't displayed that pattern, have they? I just wonder how much reason do we have to believe that Mearsheimer, who often is right, but sometimes wrong. What reasons we have to believe that his prediction on China will come true, or what reasons we have to say like no, he leaves out, let's say, the cultural factor, or other factors that you might be able to speak to.
I'm so happy you brought that because I have a great deal of respect for Professor Mearsheimer as well. But in that league of intellectuals and academia and enlightened spirits, I'm more on the side of the views of Jeffrey Sachs and Chas Freeman.
Hmm.
And
Me
I
too.
think that's my inclination.
Yeah,
So
me
I
too, me too. I wonder what your reasons are.
no, I respect Professor Mearsheimer a great deal, but the key question here is that I don't think the onus is on China in this dialogue. The onus is on United States. And can United States justify its presence and her presence without an adversary? And my argument is that in, 2040 from now, time flies from global financial crisis till now, it's what, a good 17 years, Pascal? Time just goes by like that. What is United States going to do? Pivot to India? If the predictions are that India is going to rise with the same speed and be, a fantastic content. So United States needs oxygen to justify the hegemony, you know? And United States needs a peer rival for justifying this dominance. So the onus is not on China, in my opinion. The record speaks for itself. As I said, that element of emissions, wars, coup d'etats, I mean, we have to stop and say, how can China so far hasn't occupied anywhere? I mean, the most contentious is just, across the Strait of Taiwan with, the Strait of the water is just like a chasm crossing the water to go to Taiwan. Hasn't yet, right? But the United States has gone all around the world in confrontations and military interventions. So I think this idea that China will turn out to be a peer contender, China doesn't need to challenge the United States. The United States is on an auto-destructivism mode, you know? I think I love this quote by Ernest Hemingway, which says that, um, there are two ways you go bankrupt, gradually and then suddenly. And I think United States is facing fiscal issues, but also a bankruptcy of credibility, whether it's among Western Hemisphere partners and peers, whether it's in Asia Pacific and Global South. So all China has to do is to continue with the Tai Chi and building roads and bridges and, trying to create an alternative that is more attractive. Today, BYD is eating the lunch of Tesla. If you take the same model and approach, which Elon Musk is on, on a record calling them out as sorry, excuse my French, but a shitbox as BYD just 13 years ago. What is this? I mean, who wants to drive their car, right? So if China applies the same industrial approach and refinement approach to its geopolitical model of a new alternative, inclusive world architecture. And it's very interesting, the international rules-based order. That order can be perceived in two ways. Order as an order, and
Mhm.
an order is as I order, whereas the Global Security Initiative says initiative. So it's inclusive. And I think vocabulary matters. It's very, very important. The language is the essence of how we connect and communicate with one another. So China doesn't have to work very hard, Pascal, in my opinion. China has to just sit and watch.
I agree because it's not just the United States that's on auto-destruct, it's also Europe. And in my view, China is actually not interested in them going too far down that route because there's still a lot of danger emitting from cornered animals, right? And these are animals with nuclear weapons. So, I remember how a couple of years ago in Japan, in the security circles, there was all of this talk that China followed hide your strength and bide your time strategy for at least 20, 30 years, but that by the year 2010 they were changing that approach into being more assertive. Um, uh, do you think that no, they're actually still underplaying their strength in order to not escalate the global environment to the point where they could?
I think the key question here is what is China's interest at the moment? In terms of prosperity, continuity, and I think the key question is what China has to offer to the world. What does the world need? And what is the condition and climate in which that China can continue to deliver what it has to the world? And a China in a war scenario will be constrained a great deal,
Mm.
in my opinion. It doesn't mean that China cannot lash back and hit back as a nuclear power. It doesn't mean that China doesn't have the means of really creating headache for the international rules-based order in Taiwan. But China doesn't need to exert muscle to win and to cement its position in the hearts and minds of people in Latin America or in Middle East or West Asia, as I call it, or Asia Pacific. China is doing that through development strategy, through the BRI. Whether we like BRI or not is a different story. I'm not here to say BRI is flawless. Don't take me wrong. But it's a big difference that, in the United States, according to American Engineers Association, there are around, if I'm not making a mistake, a vast number of 1,800 or 180 bridges with structural fatigue. It's just mind-boggling. It's just mind-boggling. The fact that, just one thing, the fact that there is not a bullet train connecting Ottawa or McGill University to Alberta in Canada, or I don't know, Texas to, LA, is not the problem of China. It's the deficit of vision, capital deployment, commitment in developing infrastructure at home and abroad. So if you go to Iraq today, China is developing, as I said, a renewable energy opportunity for Iraq. And renewables is something that I like to spend 2 minutes on because it is the future. And this is where, 64%, according to latest IRENA, International Renewable Energy Agency, 64% of the world's renewable energy added in 2024 was added in China. Hang in there, Pascal. At this stage, China is the most largest single-handedly driving the global energy transition. And just to contrast that, for comparison, US world's second biggest emitter, which we talked about, added only 7% of the global renewable capacity. And US has only 9% of the world's total renewable capacity to China's 41%. And the need of that global south for their development, for their growth, for their urbanization, for alleviation of poverty, whether it's Nigeria, whether it's South Africa, whether it's Kenya, whether it's Chile, whether it's Peru, whether it's Thailand and the rest of it, is to decouple from oil and gas because the cost of that ties and sucks their forex, and is to move into renewables. So China's relevance can only grow by the hour in continuing what it's doing greatly by the technologies of solar, wind, probably hydrogen, and the rest of it. So China doesn't seek confrontation anytime soon, as Professor Mearsheimer is saying. China needs stability. United States, on the other hand, could really, like a old drunken fellow in the bar who's still asking for a free drink, turn the tables up and create a mess in the pub and in the bar at the global level. The rest of the patrons would like to have a drink, talk about how they can go about their way. Can you steer up China, as Professor Mearsheimer is saying? They can. And can China lash back? They can. But is China here to systematically uproot Europe and United States? I totally disagree. I don't think, at least in our lifetimes and in another, you see this trap and all of these things make nice taglines and headlines for think tanks and the papers that are shuffled out. China needs continuity and commerce.
But this is something that I would like to ask you about. Where do you see the structural reasons for these two models? On the one hand, we have a infrastructure building superpower that built infrastructure at home massively and then went on to build infrastructure abroad massively. On the other hand, we have a previous infrastructure rich United States that is now infrastructurally decaying, is not building is not renewing its infrastructure at all. There are certain sectors in which new disruptive people came in, like Mr. Musk, right? The fact that he was able to create a car manufacturer out of nothing and in EVs is very is amazing. But this is the vision of a few. This is not a program of the country to create such infrastructure. I have had people on this channel who told me, look, Pascal, it has to do with financialization. The United States basically sucked capital out of capitalism, or the productive deployment of capital, which is reinvestment, and it all went into the financial markets where nothing is produced. It's just a casino. Do you also see that as a main factor why China is able to deploy capital in or morph capital into infrastructure and the United States isn't? Or what are the structural reasons?
I think if you look at the share of US today in terms of global output, it's 25%. So it's been in decline. The other thing is that, as you rightly said, and as we started in the beginning of our conversation, three of the most, lauded presidents of the United States were lawyers, and they all created instruments. They over-financialized financial markets. And as you rightly said, today the result is, the massive, massive public debt in the United States, the 1.1 trillion, trade surplus of China, huh? And which is massive again. And at the same time, when you look at the fact that the cost of financing and interest of the debt that United States has had has sucked all of the oxygen out of ability to deploy capital at the state level, because one is a state model, one is a market model. And United States doesn't at the state level have an oxygen to match what China is doing. It's a decentralized, as you rightly said, Mr. Musk is a, South African immigrant. And that is going to deteriorate, in my opinion, with what's happening in the United States with universities. And today, a headline in Financial Times was that, UK is benefiting from a mass influx of American students who may be coming to the UK institutions. Some may come to Kyoto, some may go to Tokyo, some may go to Canada. So the key question is the long-term trajectory is that you cannot just create financial instruments. At the end of the day, that young fellow in Mexico City or in, I don't know, I would say Rio de Janeiro needs a car, needs a fridge, needs a TV, needs a highway to be able to go, needs an MRI machine and an ultrasound to see the movement of his first child. And who's providing that? At what price level? The gyrations of US market over the past 100 days have been tied to Truth Social. It's not like there has been an announcement that, the highest gains of NASDAQ and, New York Stock Exchange were by a tweet. It wasn't by an innovation, by a patent. It wasn't a DeepSeek that came and moved the market. It was what President Trump said. So United States has become ultra addicted to financial instruments. The key question is how quickly can US go to a rehab and detox itself from this addiction? My take is that it's going to be very hard, very painful, with a lot of shivering, with a lot of shocks to the economic body of United States and the social fabric of United States. The key question then becomes, does the body have the capacity and the strength to absorb this shock? So what is the pain elasticity at the socio-economic level among Americans?
But
I don't
I don't see
see.
them actually, I don't see them having that diagnosis. I mean, I don't see them understanding that. I haven't heard enough people talk about the need to definancialize the economy. That's just a jargon I haven't perceived. And Donald Trump is not trying to induce that. He tries to induce pain abroad in order to somehow, with skewed logic, uh, uh, for that to lead then to natural reindustrialization, but not definancialization.
You're absolutely right, but that is as well where's the crux of the matter. Because, to bring iPhones back and have millions of Americans to put tight little screws on iPhones and create jobs, as Secretary Lutnick said, that's not the recipe for helping America. America has to understand that it's indebted to the world for for how it has been going around and doing whatever it wanted to, and that model doesn't work. Not just because of China, but because people have woken up and realized there's an alternative provider of services of goods. It's not just Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors. There are, a lot of other options today as well. It's not just, Apple. There are a lot of other options as well. It's not just Chat GPT. There's a lot of other options as well. And in my opinion, the world at large is fatigued with the hypocrisy. And hypocrisy and democracy rhyme together very well. So the key question is how quickly US can self-correct, how quickly US can go to what I said, a rehab, and I don't see that sadly happening anytime soon. And I think the growing debt of United States, the cost of financing its debt, which is larger today, the interest rate that United States has to pay over its debt, larger than what it's paying for its military. It's quite alarming in my humble opinion.
It is, and I worry about that because it's a source of a lot of instability. But maybe to wrap up, what's the thing that you think you keep closest, that you look at the closest, like over the next couple of months and years? What is going to be matchmaking in the way that the world develops? And since you advise companies, right? I mean, how how would you what do you tell people of what actually matters and what's noise? What do companies also, when they do investment decisions, keep an eye out on, and what do they actively need to ignore in order not to be misled on where things are going?
I think for multinationals and boardrooms, family businesses, the role of family businesses is always overlooked, and Mittelstands in Germany and across Europe, or even in global South, we all have a collective responsibility towards living together. One of the jokes I make these days, Pascal, is that these two astronauts who were stranded up in the air, and they had to send because in the old days Russians had to send them a rocket to bring them down. This time Elon Musk had to send a SpaceX and bring them back because they were sent up for 2 weeks and they got stranded. I don't know if you remember the story, just huh? And there was a silver lining in that for me, with all of this, oh, we live on Mars and we move, and extraplanetary living and all of that. That is, even the astronauts would like to come back to planet Earth. So we have to live together. And I think for businesses as well, we have to trade and with one another. And the key question is, where are the supply chains? Who controls the supply chains? Who has put its money where its mouth is in developing these supply chains? Hank Paulson was on the record a few days ago of saying the access to rare earth minerals for AI, for renewables, for sustainability is paramount, right? So China has paid the price for taking some of these most toxic, most, I would say polluting industries on board, investing in them and providing us. So Tesla is running around. American rockets are shooting targets in various parts of the world based on many of these rare earth minerals, right? The key question is how can we have access to sustainable supply chains? Will these supply chains be deployed for shooting and destroying one another or for prosperity? So for boardrooms, supply chains are paramount. And you cannot deny the role that China plays in many of these spaghetti networks. The second one is where is the demand, right?
Mm.
And the demand, I'm talking about the demand that is still vibrant and brewing. The auto debt, the house debt, and the education debts in United States are in trillions of dollars. So it's an overstretch back to financialization economy. So the demand is in global south, in global majority. So if I'm a multinational, if I'm a family office, if I'm a family business, I have to realize that the world is pregnant with some changes and business as usual will not work. And traditional advisors and consulting firms, I'm not going to name names, are cookie cutters. And, they find themselves every 3 or 4 years in a scandal here, in a, controversy there. So seek authentic advice and from people who understand the dynamics of this changing world order, emerging world order, converging world order. Try to talk to people who are not your conventional advisors, people who have their hand on the pulse of BRI, people who have their hand on the pulse of, the direction of travel of BRICS and why we call it China Shanghai China's SCO Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Why is it not Manila Cooperation Organization? Why is it not Mumbai Cooperation Organization? So there is a lot in the name. There's a lot development, and I encourage everybody to tune in into neutrality studies and to the wonderful conversations and the luminaries that you bring to your program. And we are happy to answer any questions and listen because the art of listening is a lost art as well. I think we have to listen and to realize how Chinese have arrived where they are. Was attending a conference a few weeks ago, and a gentleman broke a very interesting quote and joke, and it was tongue in cheek. He said, "In Africa, when 24 Chinese engineers." Consultants and workers arrive, the key question is how many beds do you need for a squad of 24 Chinese? Do you know the answer?
Mm.
8 beds for 24 people because the other 16 are working around the clock and the bed always remains warm. So the reality is that in a world of competition, are we producing a lot of financial instruments alone, or do we have a product that we can secure its supply chain, secure its market access, and at a price that people can afford? Otherwise, the rest is just headlines, hubris, and in my opinion, doesn't cut the mustard for the realities of the world we live in.
This is the whole question. I mean, what is reality about? What is real and what is talked up? And it's really, really, really hard, not just in security, but in business and in all of these other in all of these other aspects as well, to cut apart what people want to be true and what actually is happening. So, with this said, Ali Borhani, thank you very much for coming online. People who want to read more from you should go where?
They should go to the aliborhani.com. They should go to 360 Strategic Advisors. And I will also hopefully share with you the link to our report, which I hope will garner some curiosity, intrigue, and conversation. And people can download that report and read it and understand how China arrived here and what's still in making and where it's going.
Everything will be down in the description below. Ali Borhani, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much. Arigato, and hope to see you soon, Pascal.